All right. Hello, everyone. How are we doing today? We are back for episode 2 of Anthony's A-List. This is a podcast where every week I work with a new music artist. This is actually the feature artist for next week's episode featuring Dreams and Master Dan Levenson. For those of you who don't know, Master Dan Levenson is a career martial artist. He's been involved in Tae Kwon Do for almost 40 years. He co-founded Martial Arts America with Grandmaster Giles, or Henry Giles Sr., and he's been an active member of the community ever since. This is actually how we met. We met and bonded through martial arts when I was a tournament Taekwondo fighter a couple years ago. But anyways, currently now Master Dan has taken up playing bass playing and also has become a singer and has become very active musically. And I really thought it'd be nice to feature him on the podcast. But we'll do more of that next week. This week, I brought him in on the podcast just so we could hash out a couple of things about this week's episode. So just in case you weren't following along, this week's episode featured a jazz EDM piano piece, which also kind of turned into an electro swing piece too. I don't know if you guys are familiar with some of the subgenres of EDM, but it also kind of turned into that too. And it was a really, really fun and amazing experience for me. I'd never really tried to compose in that style, and there's also not a lot of reference material for jazz, piano, EDM. There's a lot of reference material for EDM and jazz piano, but combining the two genres was definitely something very, very different and very, very exciting for me. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed putting it together. It is now currently on YouTube and on SoundCloud as Jazzify. So go check that out if you haven't already. But to start off the podcast, why don't you talk about yourself a little bit, Master Dan, and kind of give anyone just a little bit of an intro about who you are and what you've done.
Well, Anthony, I think you kind of covered it. I've been, for most part, a career martial artist. Last 27 years I've been teaching in Tampa. I've actually been doing Taekwondo closer to 47 years. And recently I would say semi-retired due to a number of health issues. The good news is I'm coming out of that real nicely, and with your help I got involved in music, and here we are.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear that. All right, so I'd like to just start off also a little bit talking about the Jazzify piece. So Jazzify, as I mentioned before, was a piano EDM piece. And essentially it was based off the jazz blues chord progression. Now, not a lot of you might not know what that is, but that is a very specific chord progression, actually the 12-bar blues. And I know we talked about the 12-bar blues a lot, right? Which is a 1-4-1-5-4-1 chord progression. I can attach a lead sheet to this for the musicians out there that want to know about it. But on the jazz blues specifically, borrows some chords and does some alt chords and stuff like that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as the podcast goes on. But yeah, so what I really thought was cool about the piece though was most EDM pieces go over 16 bars, but this one actually covered a span of 12 bars, and the sections changed every 12 bars versus 16 in groups of 4. Right, so the form of the song and everything was kind of structured differently, and I thought that's what also made it very authentic in a jazz way. And yeah, I thought that was pretty awesome. So why don't we go ahead and take a second, and I'm gonna have you guys listen to the song right now. Master Dan is also gonna listen to it too, and then he's gonna ask me some questions based off of the material. right, we're back. Okay, so what'd you think of the song, Master Dan?
Well, first of all, I like it very, very much, and I'm not throwing sunshine at you. My, I have a lot of questions, but my first reaction was that the tune is probably what I would call accessible.
So what do you mean by accessible?
Well, jazz is a complex art form, and it's not for everybody. But I found my impression of this song is it's for everybody. I think everybody could hear it, identify with it, and enjoy it as a nice, comfortable, accessible rhythm to it, and musicianship to it, that I think that even somebody who's just into pop music and doesn't even understand jazz at all would say, I like this song.
Ah, that's a really good, interesting point. I feel like jazz is always supposed to actually be like that. You know, especially in the older days, before, jazz became what it is now, and there was a lot more material laid down. I always felt like jazz, and, especially in the early swing era and, even in bebop for the most part, I know it got way more complicated, but jazz was always supposed to be hummable. It was all supposed to be singable and just enjoyable for anyone just to listen to. And I'm glad I kind of captured that spirit. Some things that I really did is I actually did a lot of transcribing when I did that, and there was definitely a lot of older kind of jazz lines in there, like very authentic to like a bebop style,
Sure.
right, and stuff like that in the solos and in the solo sections. And I always try and make the melodies singable. I know it wasn't necessarily like an EDM format, but even as a soloist, I always feel like it's super important that you are able to sing your melody line, because it's not a melody if it's not singable.
I think you captured that successfully, and I think that's part of what I mean by being accessible. That if you played this song for somebody who doesn't understand jazz, they would be tapping their feet and saying, and well before the end of the song, they'd be humming it along with you. So, I like that very much about the song. I know that people who are just into pop music, a lot of jazz just turns them off because they don't have an ear for complex forms of music. But
I think
this,
keep going with what you're saying.
but I think this accomplished two things. For a person with an ear for music, this is a complex piece of music, and I have questions about that. But also, it's a tune that is easily identifiable, a melody that's easily identifiable, and I think everybody will like it.
Man, I think you really hit on an amazing point. Thank you for your kind words, by the way. I really appreciate it. But man, I really think you hit on an incredible point there. That people might not necessarily have an ear for it, but they'll still enjoy it anyways. And
Yes.
man, I feel like that's always the essence of jazz music or any form of like complicated music. You know what I mean? People aren't gonna understand, the complex harmonic nature of
Absolutely.
the first movement of Moonlight Sonata,
Right.
right? But when they hear it, they'll really, really like it because it does sound daunting. It sounds haunting and mysterious, right?
Right.
And no matter what's going on at a theory level, it should never really, impact that connection, right? Because I've always felt like, doing emotional work, real emotional work for the performer and the listener is always the bottom line of music. It is always the bottom line. And, having a nice chord progression, in my opinion, actually adds a variety. So it doesn't sound the same continuously, right? It's almost like if you eat some food and it tastes really good for like the first 5 seconds, but then, there's no flavor, there's no sauce, and you keep getting like nice dry food, right? I mean, it kind of tastes good, right? But then, you have it layered out with like a breakfast item, right? That's like some nice hash browns, sauteed with an egg on top, and then you transition to, like a lunch item and then something else, right? There's texture and fluidity throughout the entire meal, and that's exactly how I think about music, I always want to introduce like a new section so it doesn't feel monotonous. But at the same point in time, I don't want to throw in so many chords and so many alterations and all of this stuff that it loses its element of singability and loses its element of sounding like an actual musical song and not just a bunch of random notes.
Correct. I think we're on the same page. When I'm going to say a listener who is not a music student or scholar on any level, they're going to make their decision about the piece is, do I like it? Does it sound good? And it really comes down to that simple. They will not understand chord progression. They will not be considering 12 bars or 16 bars. Do I like it? Does it sound good? And, again, you accomplish that. And then, if I may jump into a question, when you listen to it very carefully, there's a lot of mixing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the mixing on that song, and especially in the EDM genre, can be very, very niched. And I'm glad you brought that up. So, for those of you who don't know, mixing a song is when you take a raw audio file, right? And you start. Hello, everyone. This is Anthony. This is after we already recorded everything. We had a slight technical difficulty, and I just wanted to get right back into it, but this is kind of a bridge to that. So without further ado, I'm going to get right back into me talking about mixing. Sorry about that, everyone. We had a slight little technical issue, but we are back. So anyways, Master Dan had just asked me about the mixing process, and I just wanted to briefly overview how I like to mix a specific song. So the first thing I start off with is gain. Gain is the amount of audio signal you are getting before a software essentially does anything to it. So if I'm using Logic or Pro Tools to mix a song, gain is the input signal before it starts to be processed, right? Then it goes through a series of plugins, right? And then volume is what's being heard, the volume or the gain of something after it's been processed, right? So you have input level before and input level after. What's in the middle is a whole bunch of effects. Now there's hundreds of thousands of plugins, and I'm not going to go in through every one, but I'd like to touch the two main ones. So the first one is EQ, or an equalizer. An equalizer allows you to cut specific frequencies of an audio file. Literally meaning I can literally take 1005, that specific frequency, and take it out of somebody's voice. Or I can amplify that and increase the gain on that specific frequency. I can take everything above 20,000 hertz and actually completely remove it from the audio file, which is beneficial because no one actually can hear that high, and no one can hear around about 500. So yeah, you can actually get rid of those audio files, and that actually cleans up some of the muddiness in the mix. And the second thing I like to use a lot is called compression. Compression is essentially sets the floor and the ceiling for the dynamic level of your piece. And dynamics meaning the loudness or how loud it is, right? So essentially what you can do is you can boost up the gain of an audio file. Then it reaches a specific threshold, right? Let's say 20 dB, right? Once it hits 20 dB, right, it starts to be compressed. So every single dB you get over 20, right, or every 2, it only lets 1 through. Then 2 get through, 1 can go through, and that's called the ratio. So that would be a 2-to-1 ratio of compression, right? And there's multiple different ratios, 5-to-1, essentially you're stopping it right at the threshold. 2-to-1, you're essentially setting a ceiling and allowing it to breathe without, completely trashing the audio file and completely, cramming it down, right? But those are the two main audio effects used in the mixing. A lot of other audio effects besides specialized plugins like reverb or, what have you, hundreds out there, right? A lot of them really fall in as either a compressor or an equalizer, meaning they're doing something to the frequency range or they're doing something dynamically. The last thing is stereo width. So the last thing with stereo width and how I describe this is if you've ever had an earbud not work, right? Let's say your left earbud doesn't work, right? Have you ever then noticed in your right earbud you can't hear specific things in the song that you used to be able to hear? Well, that's because there's stereo width in the song. You know, if you think about a recording or like a live band, right? There's musicians on the left and musicians on the right, right? They're not all in the center playing, right? Stereo width is that left to right, right? It's having the whole left to right spectrum covered and not having parts completely bare or having all the things on the right or all the things on the left. You can do some really cool things with it, sure, and that might be something cool you'd want to do, but that's not the standard. So those are the three things that I really focus on: EQ, compression, and stereo width. And amongst some other small minor things I'm not going to get super into, but those are like a lot of the main ones. Does that kind of answer your question about like mixing and stuff like that?
Oh, it really does. I think that somebody who completely understands what you talked about will really appreciate it.
I'm glad. All right, awesome. Do you have any last minute questions for me about the piece?
I think we kind of touched on it, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about why this piece is jazz.
Awesome, cool. So the head of the song is actually based off of a jazz piece called Tenor Madness. So Tenor Madness is a jazz standard written by Sonny Rollins, and that's really where I took kind of the head from. I really tried to make it kind of like Tenor Madness and follow the same kind of format, right? And the head is what you hear at the start of the song and at the end of the song. So the ba-doo ba-doo boo-ba-dap, ba-doo ba-doo ba-dap is the head of the song, right? And then it goes into the solos. So the solos are based off of what I like to call the jazz blues chord progression, which is very, very similar to a 12-bar blues. So a 12-bar blues generally has you play a specific chord for 4 measures of music, and we will call that the 1 chord. It will then have you switch to a chord a fourth higher for 2 bars of music, which is called the 4 chord. Then it will return back down to the 1 chord for 2 bars and continue that. And then it will go to another chord, the 3rd chord, which is a fifth above the original chord for 1 beat, then the 4 chord again, and then back to the 1 chord. That is the most basic form of the jazz blues, and it's often referred to as a 12-bar blues. Now, what's different between the jazz blues and the 12-bar blues is you try and maintain that same semblance, but you add in some changes to it. So the first change we added is instead of playing the 1 chord for 4 full measures, in the second measure, we changed right to the 4 chord. And this is called a quick change. So instead of playing the 1 chord for 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, we immediately switched to the 4 chord on the second bar. Right, I'll publish a lead sheet out there for you all to look at this too. Then we returned back to the 1 chord for 2 measures. So we had 1, 4, 1, and then on the 4th measure, instead of playing a traditional 1 chord, I play what's called an alt chord. An alt chord in jazz means you are altering some element of the chord, meaning I am altering the 9, the 11, or the 13, or the 5. And in this case, I played a very typical alt voicing where I altered the 5 and the 9. So I played instead of playing a B flat, which is what the 1 chord is in the song, I played a B flat alt, which is B flat sharp 5, sharp 9, right? And that added a lot of texture, right? And then I went to the 4 chord, and then we went back to the 1 chord, and instead of holding the 1 chord all the way through, I threw in another alt, which was a G alt chord, right? Right before I hit the another section of the song, which was where normally the 5 is, I did a 2-5-1 there, and then at the very end of the form, I did a 1-6-2-5 instead of your traditional blues ending. Okay, so those were a lot of the jazz chord progression, a lot of the jazz chord elements that I really felt like made this jazz. Hopefully that kind of made sense a little bit. I know I went on a tangent. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope that concludes this episode of Jazzify. And feel free to ask me any questions or do anything, send me a DM on Twitter, send me an email. I still read those. And I'll see you next time.